Oh, no, it's okay.
She's more like it. Yes. Oh, that's all. I think she's on top of that. Yeah. Here's the video. Here's the video. Yeah. The video on the
Good afternoon, everybody. Oireachtas colleagues, Taoiseach ministers, members of the media. First of all, thank you for being here today for the launch of Rebuilding Ireland, which is the government's action plan for housing and homelessness. The order of today will be, we're going to play a short video just to set the context for what the government is responding to. Then I'm going to ask the Taoiseach to speak to you briefly. Then Minister Donoghue will speak, and then I'll speak just in relation to the detail of the plan, and then we'll have a questions and answers session after that. The Taoiseach will need to leave in time for leaders' questions at 2 o'clock. So just in case he's walking out when I stand up, that's not a reflection on anything. So look, can I ask us now to maybe turn the lights down and play the video just to give people a sense of what we're trying to do. Ireland is a really ambitious attempt by government to provide homes for people. It's as simple as that, but also a hugely complex thing. It's about changing people's lives by providing stable, affordable homes for them. And it is the number one priority for this government.
Critically, the homeless crisis now is about housing, it's about the rental market, it's about prevention of people becoming homeless, but it's also about health, mental health, and it's about addictions. Now we need all departments working together to coordinate that, and hopefully we will get that out of this plan.
The project here in Sean McDermott Street has 18 apartments for couples straight from homelessness. As part of the Cold Weather Initiative, we opened in November 2015. It was great just to see everyone settle for Christmas. There wasn't a peep out of anyone Christmas Day. Everyone was just enjoying sitting on their couches, watching the rain out the window. It was lovely.
I was actually homeless since I was 16, the last 11 years. Absolute nightmare. Every day waking up on the street and not knowing where you're going to be sleeping again, not knowing whether you're going to be eating. We had an interview then. We got told about a week or two later that we could move in just before the Christmas. Oh, it was great. Like my own bed, my own room, just closed the door.
In the next 5 years, we are going to provide about 50,000 more social houses for our people. This is about integrating communities so they can live together, grow up together, and not be segregated on the basis of what they can afford and where they can afford to live.
Never before has there been such an appetite to deliver social housing for the people on our waiting list. Everybody, the approved housing bodies, the department, and every local authority is fully engaged. It's our business to put people into houses and into homes.
The housing sector in this country is currently broken. There are a number of reasons for that. They include a lack of investment, infrastructure around opening up large building sites to enable large-scale house building. You've also got issues with finance, and therefore that's putting additional pressure on the rental sector, which is pushing on down to social housing issues. What Minister Colvin is proposing, where he's putting together a task force with people with power to make decisions, is really key to getting things moving quicker.
I think the rental sector is not functioning as it would be hoped it would. I think everybody is more than fully aware of rising rents, particularly in Dublin. But I think the statistics would show that rents are rising all over the country.
When you look underneath the surface of the water, if you like, you can see very, very low levels of investor activity in a market where the demand for rental accommodation has grown. And as a result of that low level of investor activity, very, very strong rental inflation, which is damaging our competitiveness. The biggest problem with housing is that there isn't enough of it in the right locations. And we don't have massive oversupplies anymore that we would have had perhaps in 2008 and 2009. We definitively need to build more and produce more of the right type of properties in the right location.
The Housing Agency has been drawing everyone's attention to empty homes. We tell people that it's an amazing missed opportunity if we don't deal with it quickly. There's a huge, broad range of issues of which building supply is one part, but only a small part. The wonderful thing about the current government initiative is it's beginning to recognise this complexity and interconnectedness, and it's dealing with all of the issues. Like so many things in housing, there is no magic bullet, there's no simple fix. It's all about hard slog and dealing with things one unit at a time.
Nothing is more personal than providing a home for yourself and your family. And a lot of people in Ireland need the government's help with that right now. And this plan is about responding to that.
Thanks very much, Simon. You're all very welcome. The provision of proper housing for our people is central to the mission of this partnership government, and it's a key objective of the programme for government. One of the main features of the recent economic crisis was the almost total collapse of the construction sector and the massive reduction in the number of homes and houses being built. In effect, many families who are today living in inadequate or emergency housing are still suffering from the consequences of the past economic mismanagement in a very real and a very distressing way. We come across that very often. The programme for partnership government committed us to delivering an action plan so that by 2020 we would see 25,000 new homes being built in this country every year. Today we honour that promise, and well within our deadline of 100 days in office. This plan, believe me, is ambitious in its vision and in its scale of investment. It will take engagement across government, the involvement of local government, the real involvement of local government, and the commitment of the entire sector to deliver on it. But it is well founded, and the Minister for Housing and his team have researched and consulted very widely in drawing it up, and it is realistic. It's also urgently needed. Addressing the housing challenge fully and finally, as I say, is a key objective of the government. There is nothing more fundamental to a sense of security in the world than having a home and being safe within that home. The economic turmoil in this country in recent years has resulted in a situation where we are not building a sufficient number of houses, where those who wish to buy their first home struggle to afford that, where there is insufficient social housing for those who need to access it, where too many people find themselves homeless and in entirely inappropriate accommodation, where pressures in the rental sector have driven rents beyond what many people can reasonably afford, and where the shadow of deep, unresolved mortgage arrears hangs over people's lives. Addressing any one of these issues would be a major task in itself. Tackling them all together in a comprehensive way will be complex and will be demanding, but we are determined to rise to meet that challenge. Today, the action plan for housing and homelessness, we are setting out very clearly in a timelined and costed way how we propose to do this. And Minister Coveney will brief you on the details of the proposals that are in the plan. I want to pay tribute to him and to his team for how closely they have worked together and collaboratively with the ministers right across government and beyond in drawing up this. They have consulted with all the stakeholders. He's taken on board the recommendations made in the Oireachtas report, and I see John here, on the Committee on Housing and Homelessness, which was published on the 17th of June, following its own detailed and extensive consideration of the issues, and we thank you for that. I would pay tribute also to the committee's approach and commend it for the speed and for the seriousness with which it went about its task. Now, this action plan sets out a clear roadmap towards a country where we have the kinds of housing that people want, in the right places and available to them in a way that they can afford. It will result in a significant increase in the ambition and in the speed of delivery of social housing in particular. Minister Paschal Donoghue, as Public Expenditure and Reform Minister, has seen to it that there will be €5.5 billion available for social housing and for infrastructure, at a time when pressure for spending across the economy is quite considerable. The scale of this investment reflects the seriousness of purpose across government for dealing with this. Our plan will also help boost private housing construction and will improve the rental market. We will build on it in the forthcoming budget, when Minister Noonan will take further steps to underpin the policies that are being announced today. The plan also maps out important steps towards ending the use of unsuitable long-term emergency accommodation and includes additional measures to support those who find themselves in these very difficult circumstances. The drafting of this action plan has been a collaborative process involving a very wide spectrum of interests, and its successful implementation will rely on all stakeholders involved to achieve its ambitious targets. It sets out more than 80 key actions, each of which is assigned to specific departments and agencies, each of which is time-bound and each of which is subject to regular Cabinet review. The implementation of its actions will be actively overseen by the Cabinet Committee on Housing, which I chair, and I and my department will work closely with Minister Coveney to ensure that each commitment in the action plan is actually delivered upon. There will be no task that this government will undertake that will have such a direct impact on people's lives, and we will continue to attach the very highest priority to it. The plan is one thing, the implementation of it is another, and to give effect to that will require dedication and a real resolve right across the spectrum to bring it to reality. Thank you very much. Paschal.
Good afternoon, Taoiseach, Ministers, Member of the Oireachtas, Councillors and ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here with you all this afternoon to play a role in the launch of the Government's Action Plan on Housing. Everyone in this room is all too aware of the great difficulties caused by the failure of the housing market. The lack of affordable homes has had a deeply significant effect on the lives of many people. And this is particularly evident by the increase in homeless families in Dublin and in many other urban areas. It is because of this and other reasons that the Government is very committed to putting in place a plan to improve housing supply for the private, for the rental and for the social needs of our country. And we believe this action plan provides a very coordinated whole-of-government approach to tackling this housing and homes crisis. The 5 pillars of the plan have been laid out by Minister Coveney. They are addressing homelessness, accelerating social housing delivery, building more homes, improving the quality of the rental sector, and making better use of existing housing stock. All of these aim to provide a range of actions to facilitate, to encourage and to incentivise the increased output of private, social and rental housing. It is, as the Taoiseach has said, action orientated. It aims to double the output of housing construction and deliver 47,000 social housing homes. We face many significant challenges in funding public services brought about by a period of underinvestment following the crash. However, as the economy and employment grows under the sound management of the government, we will have more resources available to address the many needs and challenges. But in the meantime, we have to prioritise and fund those areas that need it the most. One of the biggest challenges for the government is the shortage of housing at affordable prices and rents for citizens, for families, and the unacceptably high level of homelessness. I am therefore making available an additional €2,200 million in capital to 2021. And to put this in the context of the recent summer economic statement, this is equivalent to 43% of all of the available and additional public capital that we believe will be available to the state in the coming years. This funding is being made available in this magnitude to reflect what Minister Coveney outlined in terms of the great importance that we accord to delivering against this hugely important objective for government. There are many other demands in relation to public investment and many other needs. But by assigning this level of funding, what we are aiming to do is put in place the exchequer contribution to making sure that more homes are made available to those families who need them the most. The capital budget for social housing delivery of some €5.35 billion will increase the social housing provision by 47,000 units, with a very direct impact on the lives of so many families. Our immediate focus will be on tackling the homelessness in Dublin. We want to put an end to families living in emergency hotel and B&B accommodation. Of course, the shortage of social housing is just a subset of the overall problem with housing supply. The target now is to ramp up the delivery to get to a point of 25,000 homes being built per year. Minister Coveney and I therefore recently announced a €200 million local infrastructure housing activation fund to provide the bridges, the roads, the utilities, to stimulate an increase in private housing development in Dublin and in urban areas of high housing demand. This fund will help to activate existing planning permissions for large-scale developments and should facilitate between 15 to 20,000 new homes, houses and apartments. The aim of all of this is to deliver sustainable, diverse communities with a mix of tenure. But in order for this plan to be a success, it will require engagement by all stakeholders, by government departments, local authorities, state agencies, approved housing bodies, voluntary bodies and the construction centre. We have a funded plan that can and will accelerate delivery of housing supply, and there is now an onus and a responsibility on all of us to make sure this works. And I and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform look forward to working with all in government, all in the Oireachtas and beyond to ensure these vital goals are delivered. Simon.
Great, thank you Taoiseach, and thanks Pascal. From my perspective, I just wanted to take you through some of the main themes of this report. I could spend, some of you who know me well know that I'm well able to speak for long periods of time, so I don't intend on doing that today, but what I would like to do is just highlight some of the key issues here in terms of what we're trying to do, why we've broken it up into 5 pillars, so that we have a structured report that can be used as a basis for benchmarking how we're getting on in terms of delivering on the potential of that report. But can I first of all say, before we go through that there has been a process underway here that I think has been the best example of politics functioning and working since the election. whereby John Curran and many others in the all-party Oireachtas committee that was set up to look at housing specifically came up with a whole series of recommendations. We have an appendix in this report which specifically deals with each recommendation and the response that the government is giving to that recommendation through this plan. And I think that is a reflection of the way in which we are trying to approach this in terms of working across parties to try and get expertise and views and stakeholder input through this process. And there's been a huge amount of stakeholder consultation. Many of the people who have inputted into this plan are here, and some of them spoke on the video that you would have seen earlier. So the first pillar is around homelessness. We are determined as a government to dramatically change the outcomes that many vulnerable families and vulnerable individuals get in relation to the state's response and the voluntary sector's response to the challenge of homelessness. That means more resources, more focus, more collaboration, more housing units being made available. And there is a long and detailed first chapter. And it is the first chapter for a reason, because we want people to read this chapter first as a response in relation to the housing and homeless strategy that we're launching today. And in simple terms, what we are saying is that we are going to build on what we know works. So we know that a housing first model works. And so we are going to treble the amount of housing units that are available for the Housing First plan within Dublin. From 100 to 300 housing units. We know that putting families in hotels doesn't work, and so we're going to change that. And we are setting a pretty bold ambition for this time next year to have no reliance on hotel accommodation and B&B accommodation for emergency accommodation for families. And that will be challenging, and we will set targets along the way to make sure that we deliver on that. We are looking to expand rapid build programmes, specifically to target families who are in vulnerable situations. And again, we are trebling the planned output for that rapid build programme, which was 500, is now 1,500. 200 by the end of this year, building up, I think it's 800 next year, and another 500 the year after that. We're also funding the housing agency to be able to buy up vacant houses, again, to try and deal with the pressures that we're facing in relation to homelessness. Vacant houses that otherwise would be unlikely to come onto the market. Without the intervention of the housing agency right now, working with banks in most cases and other private interests in terms of getting vacant properties into the market, into use earlier. We have worked with ministers upon to put in place a strong support package for families and children, to ensure that they get the education they need, to ensure that they can move around Dublin and travel for free, to ensure that they have nutrition that's planned for them. If you're living in a hotel room and don't have access to kitchen facilities, you can't live like a normal family. And so we need to put plans in place that make sure that that nutrition and diet becomes a feature of how we support and manage families who are in a temporary but totally unacceptable and unreal living condition while in emergency accommodation. We are, of course, building on what Francis Fitzgerald has been working on in relation to helping people that are in mortgage arrears, to ensure that we actually try and stop and block the constant feed of people who are coming into homelessness each week. Many families each week, unfortunately. And so we are looking to revamp the mortgage to rent scheme, and of course we are looking to give free both legal and financial assistance and support and advice to families that find themselves in difficult arrears situations. So the first pillar is about preventing people coming into homelessness, ensuring that we have enough emergency beds for people who find themselves in a very vulnerable position, whether they be rough sleepers, relying on hostel accommodation on a night-for-night basis, or whether they be families in emergency accommodation. And most importantly, we want to try and move them on to a more sustainable model. The kind of journey that Jonathan Flood has been on. who spoke really powerfully in the video earlier, who's now in the Sophia project. And I have to say, Jonathan, when I met you first and when you spoke, when we launched that project, you had a really big impact on the crowd that were there in terms of understanding the transition that's needed and the supports that's needed and the results of that transition when it works, which is fantastic. We also want, and I want to thank Simon Harris in particular in relation to this, we are going to see a dramatic increase in the health supports for people who find themselves homeless as part of this plan. So this year the HSE has a budget of €2 million for homeless people. Next year it will be €6 million. We're increasing it threefold. And we also have a commitment from the HSE working with a stakeholder and a service provider to actually staff a much larger addiction management and detox facility in the inner city that doesn't exist at the moment, which we're going to work through planning over the next few months on and build next year with a view to fully staffing. The staffing costs of that is about €2.25 million a year, and we have commitment from the HSE to do that. So we are trying to target here not simply building homes for people, but actually helping people rebuild their lives. Managing addiction, managing mental health, managing family breakdown, managing arrears, managing all of the pressures, sometimes all of those things at the same time, which result in somebody having to live in the streets, relying on the charity of people or the organisations that provide support services, but in many cases are under-resourced. So it's a big and strong chapter on homelessness, and I hope to get much better outcomes as a result of it. And we'll be judged on that in terms of delivering it. The second one is around social housing. I was reading Owen's tweet earlier that we're increasing the funding here by $1.5 billion. It's about $2.2 billion extra. So the capital spend at the moment that was committed to was about $3.1 billion. We're now going up to $5.35 billion. But the net result, the money is a big issue, but the net result is 47,000 housing units. A combination of acquisitions, refurbishments and new builds. And I can go into the detail of those figures maybe in a few minutes when we have questions. There's also going to be an acceleration of the housing assistance payment, which is hugely important. We are going to set up a housing delivery unit within the department to make sure that this stuff happens on time. And that there's a sense of urgency not only in my own department, but in every local authority that we're relying on to deliver these targets as well. And if that urgency isn't there, we're going to get it into the system. And we will have a group of very experienced people who will have autonomy within my department in terms of driving projects on a project management basis. And we are headhunting people for that group of about 10 people. And we've already got some really good people for that process who are up for it and who really want to drive the pace of delivery of this action plan and the 47,000 social housing units as well as the many private housing units that need to be built. I think the biggest new idea in this whole plan, apart from money and house delivery and all the rest of it, is an ambition to actually create mixed tenure developments. We have built a lot of social housing in the past in Ireland, although not recently. But we have in the past. But they have been built on acres and acres of social housing estates. And we have cities like mine where almost all of the social housing was built on one side of the river and all the private housing was built on the other, virtually. That is not a model that we are going to follow here. We're going to build and acquire and refurbish nearly 50,000 social housing units in the next 6 years, but we are going to make sure that they are integrated within private housing estates, within mixed developments, and we're going to strategically use publicly owned land banks to ensure that that happens. So many of the publicly owned land banks that we have will probably have 50% private housing on them. But the other 50% might be 20% affordable housing or cost rental and maybe 30% social housing. And you're going to drive into these estates and you're not going to be able to spot the difference between what's social housing and what's private. And that is how we need to integrate and create diverse, vibrant communities with different income levels and different needs in terms of supports from the state. And in doing that, tackle the kind of stigma that some people still hold in relation to social housing. Can I say, in relation to the third pillar, it's about increasing output. And in simple terms here, we want to double output. And we want to get there as fast as we can. John, you might just go to the next slide. I think there'll be... This is, in many ways, it looks like a very simple slide, but it's the key slide here in terms of output. If we did nothing in terms of policy and funding initiatives, in terms of changing the way in which we deliver houses, well then the green line is where we would remain as a country. The blue line is the added value that this project is about. And what we want to do is we want to get to our 25,000 figure by 2019, which will be well ahead of schedule. And I agree with many people who have commented in recent days that we need to go well beyond 25,000 in terms of making up for the deficit that has been there now for a decade. And in many ways we need to be getting to between 30 and 35,000 housing units if we can get there, in a combination of social housing build as well as private housing build. And it's a really important ambition, and we're going to go after it. But in order to do that, we need policy change. We need local government and national government working together. We need funding, particularly around infrastructure to free up sites. There's enough planning permission in Dublin for 27 to 28,000 housing units. There's only 4,600 being built at the moment. So we need infrastructure and we need the state to be targeting strategically in terms of getting sites up and running, and we are working with the private sector and indeed local authorities to make sure that happens, and it'll be on a competitive basis to make sure that we get the best value for money that we can in terms of the €200 million that Minister Donoghue has made available to us in terms of spending on infrastructure. We're relying on NAMA to deliver about 20,000 units, and in many ways they may deliver more. We'll certainly put them under pressure to do that over the next 5 or 6 years. We're going to change the planning system because we need to. And some people may be cautious about that and so on. My objective is to make sure that we make the right planning decisions, that the right design of house is being approved, that the right density of housing is being approved, and that they are being approved in the right places. But we need to make decisions a lot faster if we're going to respond to an emergency, which is what we have here. And so what I'm saying to developers now is we will legislate in the early autumn to ensure that anybody who is looking for planning permission to build more than 100 housing units will be able to go through a pre-planning consultation with the local authority, but then make their planning application directly to Bord Pleanála. And Bord Pleanála have given a commitment to me that they will make a decision within 18 weeks. And we will give them the resources and the people to do that. And so we will have more predictability and certainty around decisions, whether they be a yes or a no, which is a big problem at the moment. A planning decision and final outcome for a development of 100 or 200 houses could take 3 years at the moment, and we just don't have that time. So we will put pressure on Bord Pleanála to deliver good decisions in a timely manner, and that will, I think, provide significant planning certainty, which also impacts on funding certainty for many of the projects. We're also working with the NTMA I know that Barry Cowan and others have been talking about the need for off-balance sheet funding sources for both public housing or social housing, as well as looking at new ways of more competitive funding models for private housing. And again, through ISAF and through the NTMA, we're working through different models and different vehicles that can actually provide quite exciting outcomes there. We think, in terms of social housing, that off-balance sheet model can deliver about 5,000 housing units between now and 2021. So that's the main themes within the pillar that is about increasing output. In terms of the rental sector, we're committing to do a number of things here. First of all, before the end of the year, we are going to have a detailed review of the broader rental market. We just couldn't do it in 75 days in time. We couldn't have the necessary stakeholder consultation. There's been quite a bit of debate in the Dáil actually around things like rent certainty, security of tenure. How do we try and manage the rapidly growing rent prices that we're seeing at the moment in a way that's sustainable for tenants, but also in a way that doesn't frighten off potential new landlords and investors. And that is a delicate balance. And so we are going to spend some time and have a lot of detailed consultation on that before the end of the year, but we are committing to an outcome before the end of the year on that process. We are going to take some early actions, though. You will see an amendment coming forward, which I think will probably be referred to as the Tyrrellstown Amendment in the autumn, whereby we want to protect the security of tenure and tenancy rights for tenants that are in apartment complexes primarily that are owned by institutional investors and are selling complexes at a time as opposed to individual units at a time. And that would be the norm in most European countries. And so what we've said is that any block of apartments with more than 20 units in it, if it's being sold as a development or as a block, well then tenants' rights would be protected from one owner to the next. And I think that is a signal of intent in terms of the kind of security of tenure issues that need to be dealt with in the broader rental market. But we are also looking to assist landlords in relation to the changes that we're making and the early amendments that we're looking at making. So I'd like to strengthen the RTB to ensure that they can resolve disputes faster than they're currently able to do it. So that if you have, if a landlord has a nightmare tenant who refuses to pay rent, who's causing all sorts of difficulties and so on, that there is a method of dealing with that quickly and efficiently through the RTB and so on. So I think there's a bit of balance for both interests in relation to the early actions that we are committing to. On the rent side as well, we are committing to an affordable rent model. Which again will be about state intervention, working in partnership with private developers, but getting outcomes that will result in rent of lower cost. An affordable rental normally means rent of about 70% of market value. And there are ways in which we can do that, and if people want to ask questions on it, I'll happily go into it. In relation to there's quite a strong piece in relation to student accommodation, and there's a lot more work that's needed in that area. Students put huge pressure on the normal private rental market, and we're looking to address that in this strategy. So the final pillar is around the existing housing stock that's unused. There's about 200,000 vacant properties around the country. They're not actually all in areas where we want them, as it happens, but they are there. And so we need strategies to bring vacant properties back into use. And we have a whole series of approaches that can do that. Through the tax system, through encouraging local authorities to approach landlords and offer them up to 5 years rent up front, which essentially is a grant aid to do up their property and make it fit for purpose in terms of the rental market. And of course we're working with the housing agency to actually acquire and do up properties and so on. So you'll see you'll see a whole series of initiatives there. In terms of the barriers to actually bringing properties back into the market, you'll see a lot of commercial properties, particularly in towns and villages across rural Ireland, which I've spent a bit of time with Heather Humphreys on, in terms of trying to make the transition from a derelict or unused or vacant property to actually bringing it back into use primarily for the rental market. And we want to streamline the planning process to facilitate that, to make it very easy to get a change of use. And that goes for the city centre of Dublin, as well as rural locations where we have a lot of vacant properties above retail units that may have planning for commercial use, but actually could be converted quite easily and with a relatively small amount of spend into residential accommodation. And we are looking at essentially rethinking the conditions around that would be allowed, around how that would be allowed, streamlining the planning system, but also ensuring that the guidelines that are required of apartments and so on potentially may be given flexibility in terms of that type of reconditioning of units and so on. So there's a lot in this plan. I'd encourage people to actually, if you want to get a good sense of it, if you read the appendix at the end, you'll see the actions, who's responsible for them, what are they going to cost, and what will the outcome be. You'll also see all of the recommendations and asks of the Oireachtas Committee and all of the responses to each of those recommendations, which I think are pretty comprehensive and very credible. Can I just thank the other ministers who've been involved in this process, from Liv Radger, who very much delivered on and worked with us on the increasing rent supplement and HAP payments, to Catherine Zappone, who's done a huge amount of work in relation to families and children, to Pascal Donoghue in particular, whose officials have really spent hours and hours and hours with us in terms of costing what we need to get done, to Catherine Byrne, who's leading on the drug side, to Michael Harty, Dr. Michael Harty, who did a lot of support, and I asked him to help us as a doctor in relation to the health needs of people who are homeless. And he did a really useful report that has fed into and impacted on the content of this document. To Michael Noonan, who will deliver on his side of the bargain in a few months' time. I know there's been a lot of interest in relation to the need to support first-time buyers, and indeed some strategic supports and changes in the rental market, and I think we can expect a strong package on budget day to ensure that that is followed through on. Can I just offer some reassurance, though, to first-time buyers? Because what we don't want is any stalling between now and the budget. And so what Minister Noonan has committed to is that anything we do in the budget for first-time buyers will be backdated to today. So in other words, any choices that first-time buyers make from today, they can be sure that any changes that happen in the budget will apply to them. And so there's no need to stall. And likewise, for developers who are building houses for first-time buyers, they can also know that any changes that are being made on budget day will apply from today. So look, finally, can I thank our own team in the department who worked literally through the weekend, this weekend and last weekend, for an extraordinary piece of work. And I think this isn't perfect. It's not the complete answer, but it's a really good start, in my view, for a campaign that I am going to relentlessly pursue with government colleagues over the next 2 years or so, or for however many years we have, to deliver for people who are relying on government to help them access a stable home. Whether that's through the private sector or indeed through the public sector. And finally, can I thank my colleague Damien English, who's very much been part of this process from the very start, and who of course is a minister in my department as well. So I'll happily take any questions that people have, and Katrina's going to manage that.
Okay, so if you can just raise your hand and where you're from and what minister you'd like to ask. Niamh, do you want to kick off?
I see the targets that you have in relation to homelessness at the back, and there are quite a number of them, but there doesn't seem to be an overall target for eradicating homelessness completely. I mean, that is possible, don't you think, in a small country? Do you believe it is possible for both the rough sleeper side and the people who stay in emergency accommodation, and would you be prepared to put a date on when it could be done by?
Well, first of all, I think it is possible. I think there will always be cases of people who, for often very complex and personal reasons, find themselves homeless. And really what the state needs to do, working with all of the agencies that are in this space, is they need to be able to respond to that quickly, so that there is an appropriate level of emergency accommodation for that kind of person, to be able to support them and help them get back on their feet again and find long-term stable accommodation. And I would like to think we can get to a point where nobody has to sleep in the streets, and nobody has to rely on the uncertainty of whether or not they'll get a bed at 10:30 at night when you make the final call to see whether you'll be accepted into a hostel in Dublin. That is not an acceptable situation, and I've spoken to many people who find themselves in that position. So what I am willing to say is that from a homeless family point of view, we'd like to set a target of a year's time to not be relying on hotels and B&Bs for family emergency accommodation. That puts a lot of pressure on us to deliver alternative housing units or accommodation for those families, and we need to deliver on that. But I certainly hope in that period of time as well, we'll be able to provide much more sustainable outcomes for people who have the uncertainty of sleeping rough at the moment. But I mean, look, let's see how we get on. We're going to set sort of quarterly targets for ourselves, and we look to publish those figures. I mean, at the moment, today we have new figures on homelessness, and they're up again. And I think we'll publish them this afternoon. So it's still going in the wrong direction. So we have a lot of work to do in this area, but I think we have the resources now to do that, and we have the cross-government and cross-departmental support to make it happen as well. And I'll be working with the Oireachtas committee on this. I know we have the chair of the Oireachtas committee here, Maria Bailey, who's very anxious to facilitate that debate from an Oireachtas committee point of view. So I'll be transparent and upfront about how we're doing. And if we're not succeeding, well then we'll be held to account for it.
Okay, Kevin, please.
Mr. Coveney, one thing we haven't seen in your presentation is where we're going to find the builders or the developers, because obviously at the minute, anecdotally at least, there's a severe lack of building taking place. So how can you be confident that you're going to actually have enough people working in construction to actually carry out the building that you've suggested here? And just secondly, I know you've thanked almost everybody in the room for their input to this particular plan, but this is now, your reputation is staked to this particular plan. Can you give us some sort of idea when you think Ireland will have a normal housing market that we can actually say this is the baseline?
Yeah, they're fair questions, and this is my responsibility. We've seen an extraordinary sort of government agreement. I mean, Pascal was talking about 43% of available extra resources between now and 2020 being dedicated to housing. But if you look at 2017, 60% of the available headroom is going for housing. There's an availability of about 250 million euros for extra capital spend, and 150 of it is going in housing. So don't be under any illusion. This is the number one priority for government in terms of spending, and it's my job to make sure that we deliver on that in terms of not simply putting this on a plan, but actually going out and selling it and making sure that local authorities, approved housing bodies, the voluntary sector, that everybody is geared up to be able to deliver what they need to deliver to make it happen. I don't accept actually that we don't have the capacity within the construction sector to build enough houses. I mean, don't forget, there was a time when we were building nearly 90,000 housing units in Ireland. Since then, we've seen the numbers of people working in construction dramatically increase, but many of them haven't gone that far. Many of them are in the US, they're in the UK, some of them are a long way away in places like Sydney and Canberra, but certainly the industry tell me that if it makes financial sense for them to build houses, they'll build them again, and they'll get the skill set to be able to do that. But part of this plan is actually dramatically ramping up apprenticeships within the construction trade again, because effectively, I talk about doubling output, but we need to get close to trebling output, to be honest, before we start pulling back, which hopefully we'll be in a position to do in about 7 or 8 years' time. But when we get to building 25 or 30,000 housing units a year, then I think we're back to some kind of normality, and I think we can be there in 2019.
Okay, Juno. Oh, sorry.
I've got 2 points in relation to Kevin's question there. In the work that Simon and I did in relation to setting up the local housing infrastructure fund, a constant area of feedback that both of us got is that within the civil engineering space, the capacity is there now to be putting in place the utilities, whether they be bridges, roads, electricity and gas infrastructure. And both Simon and I are very confident that we will see the prompt drawdown of that fund across the early part of next year. And number 2, both of us have put great focus on the role of our local authorities, because within our local authorities they have the capacity, they have the engineering expertise, they have the heritage of being large housing providers in the past, and the government as a whole will really look to them to play their role now, particularly in the delivery of the social housing plan, behind which the government agreed today significant additional funding.
Okay, Juno, and then we're going up to Newstalk after that.
Minister, you said your ambitions are to make sure that there's 25,000 new units, possibly by 2019, ahead of the target. Can you maybe break that down for us a little in terms of what type of units and where? And then to go back to Kevin's question, when ultimately do you and the government see the housing crisis not being a crisis anymore? And lastly, just you talked there about the kind of the carrot and stick approach with developers and industry and incentives and getting it moving again. What about the stick approach when it comes to local authorities? They've been very slow to take on board social housing units. Can you maybe outline, what's going to happen there, and the vacant site levy? That doesn't seem like it's going to be brought forward either. Thank you.
Well, first of all, the vacant site levy is being brought. It's going to happen, and we'll introduce it as soon as we legally can. Right. So, but when you levy somebody for inactivity, you have to give them due opportunity to provide activity on the site, if you like. And so the advice we have from the AG is that you have to give a time for planning application, putting funding in place for a big project and so on. But certainly, if we can do more to prevent speculators buying up zoned land at very high prices, competing with developers who want to build on it in the next 6 months or the next 12 months, well then I'd like to do that. But there's not an easy way to do it. And there is some evidence that we do have investment funds buying up zoned land with a view, I presume, to flipping it on in a few years' time because they see the pressures in the market and therefore prices increasing. That's not a healthy situation. It's unhelpful in terms of the availability of zoned land, and what we want and need to do is we need to get that land into the hands of builders who will build. And unfortunately, the competition between builders and investors at the moment is driving land prices not quite back to where they were in the crazy times, but it's moving back in that direction. And that's why we need a disincentive for people to buy up land if they're not going to build on it. And it's something that I obviously want to speak to Minister Noonan about in advance of the budget in terms of what we could do in that area. But it's an issue. What were the other questions? 25,000. Oh yeah, sorry, 25,000 units. Look, 25,000 units actually isn't that many houses. We were up to 88,000 for a while. We have, particularly in Dublin, a lot of publicly owned sites, and we have some very significant strategic development zones that can build or facilitate the building of a lot of houses in a relatively short period of time. I think you'll see a number of developers announcing new projects of 1,000 houses or more in the not too distant future on the back of this. So I think if you're talking about the split of 25,000 housing units, you're probably talking about maybe 5,000 of them of the new builds being social houses, the other 20,000 or so being private, and of course some of that private will then become social because of the Part 5 provisions, and then added to that then in terms of social housing you'll have significant acquisitions and so on. But in terms of new build, Damien and I were actually totting up the number between now and the end of 2021, and we're hoping that we can build on this plan and the predictions in it about 134,000 housing units in that period of time. But the figures will start below 25,000 and then move up past it. So the challenge for me is to try and get those numbers built as early as possible, while at the same time respecting the integrity of the planning system and procurement process and financing models and so on.
Okay, thanks for that. Can you go to Newstalk and then just go over and then back down to Martina after that? Thanks.
Minister Coveney, Paul Gallagher from Newstalk. Just on social housing, 47,000 social houses. I think that's about 12,000 more than your predecessor promised. Is that ambitious enough, firstly? And secondly, on that, action point 2.1 talks about particularly focusing on new build projects by local authorities and approved housing bodies. How much of the 47,000 do you think will be by the local authorities and AHBs, and how much do you think will be just leased or bought from the private sector?
Okay. Yeah. No. Well, first of all, if you break it up in terms of build acquisitions and then a mix of build and acquisitions, because it's there will be long-term leasing arrangements and so on, working with approved housing bodies and so on. Direct build about 26,000. Direct acquisitions about 11,000, and then about another 10,000 a mix of acquisitions and build and leasing arrangements. Some of them will be build as well. So you're certainly talking about over 30,000 of the 47,000 being actual build, I would say. And then if you add to that the ramping up of the HAP payments, or the housing assistance payments, which by 2021 we'll have an extra 134,000 people on. Which is a huge number actually when you think about it, because people are going to make the transition from rent supplements to HAP payments over that period of time. That's the plan anyway. Then you start to see the extent of what we're trying to do around supporting people who need the state's help in terms of the affordability of either renting or buying, or accessing a social house. So yeah, the 47,000 is broken up between just over 26,000 direct build acquisitions, just under 11,000, and then a mix of build and acquisitions, which involves sort of leasing programs through different vehicles and funding models and so on, particularly through approved housing bodies, of another 10,000 or so, and that's how that figure is broken down. And don't forget, when the housing committee asked for 50,000, that was a combination of build, acquisition, and refurbishment. So we're pretty close to hitting that target. And as I say, there's an extra 2.2 billion euros of capital expenditure to make sure that we get there.
Okay, so Martina, and then over to Katie.
In relation to the central bank restrictions on mortgage lending, is it the government's view now they're here to stay? And is the first-time buyers grant really a way around that? And secondly, in terms of the first-time buyers grant, I know the details of which are going to be announced in the budget, but are there going to be any restrictions in terms of the size of a house you can buy with this grant, or is it going to be means tested, or so on?
Yeah. Sorry. First of all, can I just correct a figure that I just gave? The 134,764 to be exact is the total breakdown of social housing, if you like. Sorry, just under 84,000 will be HAP, and then 47,000 will be the combination of what I outlined, and just over 4,000 will be RAS. So that's the breakdown. Sorry, just to be accurate on that. We will get in the budget a package for first-time buyers, which hasn't been signed off yet. Obviously, Minister Noonan wants to speak to the central bank about that, and we've been talking about how we ensure that this will boost supply as well as increase demand. I mean, what you don't want to do is to increase the capacity for first-time buyers to spend more without actually having a corresponding increase in supply. So this needs to be a supply boost as well as a help to buy plan. I think it'll be done through the tax system in the form of a rebate, and there'll obviously be parameters for it in terms of the value of the house that a first-time buyer gets support to buy. We're not in the business of supporting the purchase of mansions. This is about sensible provision of family homes that first-time buyers need to access, and so Minister Noonan will outline the detail of that in a couple of months' time.
Okay, so we're going to do to your next motion.
Going back to 47,000.
Yeah.
That's on.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
47,000. When does that start? Does that start from now, or does it start from the beginning of last year? And also, when you say acquire, does that mean the local authorities, approved housing bodies, are going to own them, or are they going to lease them? So I'm asking what percentage of that 47,000 is actually going to be private? And then I was just looking at the figure of 70 million to the housing agency to acquire vacant units. In the draft plan which I saw, it talked about 400 units, which would make a cost of 175,000 per unit, which sounds kind of reasonable. In this plan you're saying 1,600 units, which is €43,000 per unit, which sounds kind of fantasy land to me. Just wondering.
Sorry, which figure is that? Can you just say that again? Sorry.
Okay, so you've said you're going to give 70 million to the housing agency to acquire vacant units.
Yeah.
And in the draft I saw, it talked about 400 units being acquired, which would be a cost of about 175,000 per unit.
No, it's 1,600, but I'll explain how that works.
1,600 at 43,000 a unit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll explain how that works. Okay, first of all, we're going to allow the housing agency to manage a fund of 70 million, and they will be able to deliver 1,600 vacant properties with that money. But they don't simply just buy them. What they do is they initially buy them, but then they work with approved housing bodies or with local authorities to effectively either sublet them or resell them to those approved housing bodies, who will then fund that through the lease or rental scheme that they'll have with them. So it's a rolling fund that gets used to initially buy stock, which then gives a return on that investment to allow you to buy more stock. So it's a multiplier effect, essentially. So you don't simply divide 1,600 you don't simply divide 70 million by 1,600, because that wouldn't make any sense. So you'll see how, and we'll provide the details of how that plan will work. But we estimate that with a seed funding, if you like, to start the process of 70 million, we'll get about 1,600 houses purchased, and some of them will be directly from the banking sector. So, we've been speaking to AIB, for example, in recent weeks. We think we can move early on about 220 units, and likewise, other banks are in discussions with the housing agency to try and get access to vacant properties that otherwise wouldn't find their way into the market anytime soon, because we don't want to be competing with the private sector for houses either. There was a question about the breakdown of the 47,000. Sorry. In terms of ownership, no. I mean, practically all of them will be in public ownership. They'll either be in the ownership of an approved housing body, or they'll be in the ownership of a local authority. So whether you acquire, whether you build, or whether you have a long-term leasing arrangement with a vehicle that may be put in place by ISA for the NTMA, either way the state controls that housing stock.
And when does that 47,000 start?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no. Starting in 2016. So it starts now and it finishes in 2021.
Okay, and your colleague next to you, and we'll do FIAC after that.
Can I ask you some Dublin-specific questions? You mentioned 134,000 homes would be built by 2021. Was that, am I correct in that figure, nationally?
No. What I'm saying is that we will provide an extra 47,000 social housing units through a combination of new build and acquisitions.
No, I'm sorry. I'm referring to 134,000. Did I not hear that figure?
Yeah. Sorry. The 134,000 will be social housing solutions. Right. 83,000 of them will be in the private rental market, being supported through the housing assistance payment.
Can you tell me? Sorry, I was confused about that figure. Then, can you tell me specifically how many houses you see being built in Dublin either each year? And I'm talking about private and social, each year in Dublin, or by the end, by 2021?
Well, I mean, first of all, this is a national plan. It's not just Dublin. But obviously most of the pressure in terms of numbers are in Dublin. So of that new build, void refurbishment and acquisitions, obviously quite a high percentage of that will be in Dublin. But I can get you an exact figure on that, but I don't have the exact breakdown between Dublin, Limerick, Cork, Galway, Waterford. But you can take it that a big percentage of it will be Dublin.
And then on specific areas that, say, Dublin City Council would have earmarked for housing, for large housing projects, as you've mentioned here, public and private on public land. Are you specifically addressing these in the plan, or will that be a matter of the local authority?
It'll be both, really, because we'll have a housing delivery unit that will be working with local authorities. So don't forget, when a local authority has a social housing build programme, they have to get sign-off from our department to make sure that we get value for money, which Pascal's department will insist on, and they're right to make sure that we get sign-off on standards, design, density, amenity value, and so on.
I'm more asking though, are you referencing specific sites in Dublin or in other local authorities? Are you referencing specific sites in the plan and saying what you want on those sites?
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't dictate to local authorities.
Or what can be done.
But what we want is some pathfinder projects to show what, and we've said that we're going to take 3 pathfinder projects, and we have a pretty good idea where they are, to actually show what can be done on publicly owned land with new thinking. And we want to challenge the private sector to actually come up with design solutions for the objectives that we want for those sites, which are mixed developments, mixed tenure developments, different sizes, catering for different family sizes, a mix of social housing, affordable rent, and private housing. And that is the kind of social housing model that we want to try and develop now. And we want to have sort of exemplar examples, particularly in Dublin, of projects, and we're working with a number of the local authorities in the Dublin area to actually use a number of those projects as an example of how it can be done.
May I ask you just finally, when you mentioned things being speeded up, larger projects by going to Borcanola, you're referencing a current delay of maybe about 3 years in the system. Well, it depends on what would you like to see on Borcanola approving those? What time frame would you like to see that?
Oh, well, I mean, once they go to Borcanola, 18 to 20 weeks. But we've got a commitment from Borcanola on the 18 weeks. But of course, I mean, there's a big onus on developers to do a lot of work in advance of that application. So, pre-planning consultation for a large development should take more time than the actual planning consideration, because you have to make sure that there's consistency with local area plans, with local transport infrastructure, and all sorts of other things that need to be done. But by the time the application is formally given to Bord Pleanála, we hope that developers will have done their work in a professional manner so that they can get a decision in 18 weeks. Okay. And I mean, what you would have got in the past, by the way, is a lot of requests for further information coming from Bord Pleanála, which then doubles the length of the time. The whole process starts again. We're not going to do that anymore. And so if a developer can't actually put a professional enough application together to actually get a decision on the basis of a yes or no, well then he or she has no business putting an application into Bord Pleanála. So we want very significant and detailed pre-planning consultation to happen first. We don't want people applying for 10 stories to get 8. We want to get high quality applications with high quality design in mixed developments, and we're going to give Bord Pleanála the resources to be able to make quick decisions.
Okay, well, David and then Fiach
I'm just wondering, do you accept the arguments put forward by the construction sector to the effect that house building isn't attractive or profitable at the moment, and do you worry at all that they might be rubbing their hands now and looking at this plan and thinking of converting your political difficulty into some kind of commercial opportunity?
Well, I think it is. Well, first of all, if you look at what was built last year, so I mean, I can only deal with the evidence that's there, right, rather than what people promise or say. Last year we built 12,500 housing units in Ireland. 6,000 of them were built as one-off houses in the countryside. Okay, and that's likely to continue more or less indefinitely. The other 6,000, a high portion of that 6,000 were actually unfinished housing estates that were finished out, or unfinished apartment complexes that were finished out. So actually new build, in terms of starting new build on brownfield or greenfield sites, has really been a non-starter. I was in Galway a couple of weeks ago talking to the housing officer there. There has been one planning application in the whole of County Galway for a housing estate in the last 7 years. One in Ardmore. That's it. For the whole county. One of the biggest counties in the country. So that is the level of stall that has happened in this sector. So actually getting it moving again is going to take some effort, and there's a lot in this plan to try and get that moving, and I think we'll do more as this project continues. As I say, this isn't the perfect solution, and if there's mistakes in it, we'll change them. I'm not wedded to everything, but I think this is a good effort and a good starting point to try and get the thing moving. And we've got the consultations we've had with the building sector have been positive, and I think they will welcome a lot of what we're proposing here. But they still have to get significant finance, and it's much more difficult to get finance now than it was 10 years ago. And they need to build capacity to be able to get economies of scale. I mean, the reality is that in most parts of the country still, the price of a new house, if it's built, is more expensive even at cost than the house next door, which might be for sale in terms of the second-hand market. And as long as that gap remains, very hard to justify building new houses. So we are, one of the initiatives here is we are going to have a competition for the private sector to find ways of building houses more cost effectively while maintaining standards, and we will reward people who win that competition with access to state lands, for example. So this is about driving more efficiency, reducing the cost of building homes, and this is all about one objective, which is to provide affordable homes for people. It's as simple as that. So at the moment the gap is there between what builders say they can build a house for and what first-time buyers say they can afford to get a mortgage for. And we need to narrow that gap by increasing the capacity of first-time buyers to be able to buy and reducing the cost of building a house. And once we close that gap, I think you'll see a dramatic increase in the supply of houses for first-time buyers. Because we have this very unusual situation where we have huge demand to buy houses amongst first-time buyers, but actually very low capacity to actually buy at the price that houses are being sold at. And until you fix that, you can't expect developers to build houses for first-time buyers because they can't buy them, and you certainly can't expect first-time buyers to be able to magic up a mortgage if they can't raise the funds for a deposit, and if the amount that they can borrow is linked to their income stream.
Okay, and we have two.
Can I just to add to what Simon has said there, David? One of the pieces of feedback that Simon's department provided back to government was that a significant element of the cost that developers were facing was in relation to the cost of infrastructure.
Yeah.
And again, that is one of the reasons, David, why we launched the Local Housing Infrastructure Fund, and we actually made the decision to signal the launch of that a number of weeks ago to make clear to local authorities that for large pieces of infrastructure that would make it more affordable for the developers to go ahead and provide homes, the Exchequer would make a contribution to that. So that's another way in which we're seeking to address the equation that you've referred to.
So, I mean, reducing the cost of a house will be one, state intervention in relation to an infrastructure fund, which otherwise would have been piled on the cost of a house previously. Secondly, the much more strategic use of state-owned lands, which again can reduce the site value. I mean, you can be looking at site value in the cost of a house at 40 grand. If you can reduce that, you dramatically reduce the cost of a house. And then we have this other competitive process around driving new design approaches and so on, and new materials and new ways of putting houses together that can reduce the cost of building a house. So it's so
the more innovative and efficient builders will get quicker access to the state land.
They will. Yeah. They will. The best builders with the best design approaches that maintain high quality but reduce the cost price of a house will be the ones that will get priority treatment.
Okay, we're going to take two final questions, Fiach and Owen, and as I know Pascal has to go and you have another one to go.
Just on the issue of the first time buyers grant, that's a matter for the budget, as you said, for Michael Noonan, but the reality is you're not going to get that budget through the House without the support of Fianna Fáil, and in their manifesto they called for some form of a grant to top up whatever mechanism this scheme takes, but that it would be to the value of €10,000 per couple and €5,000 per person. So do you accept that you're going to have to introduce a scheme that would in fact give a couple €10,000 in order to get it through the House and win the support of Fianna Fáil? And secondly, you spoke of off-balance sheet mechanism. There is still some confusion about how Eurostat is classifying developments of social housing. Have you been given assurances that these developments will be off-balance sheet, or when do you expect those assurances to come?
On the second issue first, and I've really tried to avoid the use of the term fiscal space because I know it irritates the hell out of people, but there is a big issue here. If we could, we'd spend more. And so we're speaking to the NTMA and to ISIF in particular about getting funding vehicles that can finance social housing and also can help the finance of private housing more competitively. But particularly on the social housing side, there is a model that's called the NARPS 1 model that NAMA use at the moment, which essentially means that they can pay for the building of a house and then they lease it to a long-term lease to an approved housing body that then sublets it to a social housing tenant. And that works and it's off balance sheet. And we're looking to replicate and build that. But we do need to get clarity from Eurostat in terms of what works and what doesn't. Recently in the UK, an awful lot of their social housing, which was considered off balance sheet by the British government up until recently, has now been deemed on balance sheet by Eurostat, which has caused huge problems there. So we want to avoid that kind of problem for Minister Donoghue and for the rest of us in a few years' time. The Commission have been quite helpful in this, and we are looking to get to actually use Ireland's National Housing Plan as a template for Eurostat to look at to provide clarity around some of these issues. And we'll be setting up meetings in Brussels to try and get clarity around some of those issues. So it's quite a positive development actually in that regard, but it's just going to take a bit more time. On the budget, let's just be clear. The confidence and supply agreement is pretty clear. We will have the support of the main opposition party as long as we fulfil what we both agreed in terms of policy priorities. And one of those policy priorities was around housing and increased housing supply. And as far as I'm concerned, we're following through on that. And it'll be Michael Noonan who will design and decide and bring forward the support package for first-time buyers and any other areas around the budget. And I expect we'll get the support under the confidence and supply agreement that comes with that. I'm not going to give you a figure now. It's you're pretty good actually at getting figures out of me, so I'm not going to give a figure. I'll let Michael Noonan do that in a couple of months' time.
My own officials are going to be meeting the European Commission along with the Department of Finance in relation to the classification of housing projects in the future and the very kind of uncertainty that Simon referred to in relation to how they're classed now and how they could be classed in the future is the reason why there's such a significant increase in exchequer funding. You may have had an expectation in the past of seeing the additional housing output being delivered through greater use of off-balance sheet funding. What you're seeing now happening due to the work of Simon is a significant increase in on-balance sheet funding so we can provide certainty that these homes will be delivered.
Okay, Owen, and we're going to wrap up.
Thanks, and congratulations, Simon, on the publication of the plan. I look forward to reading it in detail. I have two specific questions about the spend on social housing. As you know, Alan Kelly's plan goes up to 2020, where your plan goes up to 2021, so there's a full year additional spend in your plan. Yeah, except his started in 2015. That's true. It starts in 2016. So, but my question is this, the extra expenditure in your plan in comparison to his, can you confirm how much that is up to 2020? Because my calculations is it is about 1.5 billion. Yeah. Can you also tell us what the additional capital and current expenditure for next year are? How much extra money will actually be spent on capital and current for social housing in addition to the 400 million on capital and the 500 million on current this year?
Yeah, I'll come back to you on the second one with an exact figure because I'll have to search through it to get an exact figure. But on the broader one, in terms of the capital side, so there's a figure in this of 3.8 million, which you're rightly calculating, and you're taking 3.8 from 5.35, and you're getting 1.5 billion. The 3.8 was a combination of capital and current. So what the 5.35 is capital predominantly. So if you look at the capital that was in the previous plan, it was 3.1, and the capital that's in this is 5.3 or so. And so that's where I get the figure that I'm talking about, which is 2.2 billion extra in terms of commitment, which comes from. Yeah, but yes, it does. But we start a year later. So Alan Kelly's plan started in 2015 but finished in 2020. We started in 2016 and finished in 2021. So you can, I suppose, it depends how you want to cover that. But they're both 6 years. That was the.
And the additional capital for next year is €150 million. Well, out of the additional fiscal space Simon has already referred to, there's 150 million, that 250 million being used.
Yeah, sorry, that's additional on what's
already been spent.
Okay, all right, thanks a million for that, folks.